the media's gotten very splintered. So what happens is, these cable shows and these talk show hosts, a lot of them have figured out the more controversial I can be. If I'm going out there and I'm calling Obama this name or that name, or saying he wasn't born in this country, that will get me attention. I will then write a book. I'll go and sell it.
And I'll name it Trickle Up Poverty by Michael Savage. It's on our website. LauraIngraham.com. The President of the United States. He could have very well have just said, well, Laura Ingraham, Michael Savage, all these other people have written books, and Savage, what do you make of that? The President is obsessed with anyone who criticizes him. He cannot take the criticism.
No, because he's lived inside the bubble, the glass bubble of the university. Also, white liberals, as you well know, kowtowed to him his entire life, greased the skids for him. The man has never encountered any criticism, and so therefore he's not used to it. But what he's doing in that, Laura, is changing the argument. He's hiding the fact that during the meltdown in the banking system that led to his election, a lot of people got richer than they ever dreamed of being. In other words, there were assets of about $10 trillion that were driven down in 2008. But there was an agenda lurking behind the shadowy dealings that brought that about. In other words, I say in the book that Christopher Cox was under pressure, then chairman of the SEC. He was supposed to be the watchdog of Wall Street. He was pressured by lobbyists, and he did not prevent the change of two regulations, the uptick rule and another one, that allowed hedge fund pirates to plunder the U.S. financial markets. And this single change in policy was responsible for driving down the value of America's assets by more than $10 trillion in '08. What does it have to do with Obama? Because there was an agenda behind the shadowy dealings. As a result of that, they were able to bring along this virtually unknown senator from Illinois and make him the savior. And they put him in office. They rigged the election. They rigged it by destroying the economy. It didn't happen by chance. And the reason I say that is because a lot of this money didn't disappear. It actually wound up in the pockets of some very powerful people. I can name them, and I do. There's the Managed Funds Association, MFA. Have you heard of them? You know who they are.
Yes.
A group of hedge fund investors with whom Soros is affiliated. They actually lobbied SEC Chairman Cox to have the rules change. And why did they do it? Remember, Soros had been after changing America's politics for a long period of time. He wanted, in my opinion, to engineer a raid on U.S. markets in order to trigger a financial crisis that they clearly foresaw would turn the election in favor of their '08 candidate, Barack Obama. And this time the strategy worked.
Well, here's what we know is that this push to drive people into homes, to make sure everybody has to own a home because you have to level the playing field. What Peter has to be given to Paul, and then this big push to get everyone buying houses even if they couldn't afford it. That ended up creating this sick scenario where people who couldn't afford it were shoved into homes, and then they got these loans. They couldn't pay them back when the values went down, and it was a huge mess. And this was driven mostly by Democrats, frankly, who didn't want to regulate or have any more reins on Fannie and Freddie. They just didn't want it. And Barney Frank's ex-boyfriend was working at Fannie Mae at the time in a very senior position.
Well, we're not surprised by the cronyism of any administration, but it's gotten nakedly apparent to the American people, which is why there's a revolution brewing in the country. Laura, can I go back to the uptick rule, which is so important
yes.
On the Wall Street issue, because it's something new that's not discussed in most other books. But in researching it, I was shocked to find out that these two rules enabled these people to raid the financial markets, again, generating huge profits, causing the financial crash of '08, and then enabling Barack Obama to be elected. They engineered the fraud that ushered in the era of the socialist oligarchy in the United States. And what I'm getting at is the uptick rule. And I mean, I could spell it out. What is it? It's very simple. This rule was one of the primary reasons we were able to recover from the Great Depression. And this single rule, the uptick rule, limited short sales to stocks whose last trade was higher than the previous one. The uptick rule meant that traders who sell short could not cause the market price of a stock to drop continuously at a precipitous rate. And once this rule was removed, naked short selling was enabled, and the circumstances were ripe for a raid such as the one that occurred in '08. And that there's a couple other rules. I don't want to bore your listeners, but it's very important that we understand that we keep hearing he saved the economy. Without him, everything, we would have had another Great Depression. It's nonsense. This has been orchestrated from the beginning, Laura, and I document this. I don't just say it, I document it.
Trickle Up Poverty is Michael Savage's new book. We're going to open this up, 800-876-4123 on the Laura Ingraham Show. Earlier in the show, Michael, I was talking to callers about how they were changing their lives. The American dream having been perhaps permanently altered by this administration and the Democrats' approach to these issues, especially, and also Republicans who were irresponsible at the same time. And so you should hear these callers. People saying they spent $13 on Christmas presents last year, and this year it's not going to be any better. I mean, the tales of woe and concern and anxiety. I mean, it cuts you right into the heart. I mean, it's horrible. Meanwhile, this man is dancing with Paul McCartney and Beyonce and having parties and worried about how much we're what kind of organic food we're eating if you're his wife.
Yeah, well, you don't get me started on the First Lady, because when I hear her talking about health foods, since I'm an expert in the field, and the vegetable garden, and every time she goes to Martha's Vineyard,
she planted that.
She comes back 8 pounds heavier. Every time she's photographed, she's eating an ice cream cone, and then she wipes the ice cream off her lips, and then tells us to eat fruit slices. There's no bigger hypocrisy than this, Laura, and you could see it in the food stories, honestly. But that's the least of our problems. I mean, that's really the least of our problems. And if we just moan and complain about it, then what good is it all? I actually have 37 points that I think are worth discussing, because the Republicans listed, remember their plan for America about 2 weeks ago? You looked at it very carefully. There were an awful lot of things that were very good in that, but they left out anything about closing the borders. They left out an awful lot about social issues. There was not one mention of social issues in the Republican plan, and frankly, they didn't talk about cutting spending at all. They just were generic about it. They were not specific, and so I have very, very specific, ideas, Laura, that can become a litmus test. I think that should be applied to any politician.
Yeah, I like you have some unusual entries here in this 37-point pledge.
I want to hear the most unusual one.
I like Save the SEALs, because you're talking about the Navy SEALs. Stop the prosecution of our military men and women for doing what they need to do to defeat the jihadists who are trying to destroy what we love about this country. And we've seen these prosecutions go on and on, ruin lives, ruin families, and I like that.
Well, I've raised money for these falsely accused Marines. It's a shock. But as I say in many places, you can't fight a war in ballet slippers. We must stop requiring that our soldiers do a plie before they ask the Islamic terrorist if he'd consent to being handcuffed and taken away. How in the world have we gotten to this point that our soldiers... I have a young man who works for me, Laura. He's a combat veteran, a machine gunner in Iraq for 2 tours. I asked him, do you know what your mission was over there? You know what he had said to me? He said, nobody knows what their mission is. He said, we knew what our mission was to go out and get shot at and shoot back. He said, basically, we're set out as decoys to attract fire and then shoot back. There is no mission. Nobody knows what they're doing there, Laura. It's a nightmare.
No, and you have there's great stuff in here. I've got to say, I have a 10 for 10, which is kind of my 10 points that I unveiled in September of '09. But this goes into boot the czars, obviously, the Glass-Steagall Act, make abortion illegal. I mean, they don't want to go anywhere near, for the most part, that issue. They had very passing reference to the life. Name the enemy, define what it is that we're opposed to in this war against the jihadists. Actually use the phrase Islamic jihadists. And I want to share with you this soundbite, Michael, and then we're going to take a break and we're going to get to calls because a lot of people want to chat with you. This was on This Week with Christiane Amanpour, one of the imams they had on the panel who warned of this. Let's listen.
So do you agree with Reverend Graham that Americans should fear Islam?
We do believe as Muslims the East and the West will one day be governed by the Sharia. Indeed, we believe that one day the flag of Islam will fly over the White House.
The flag of Islam will fly over the White House, threatening, and basically then he looked at Daisy Khan, the wife of the Imam Faisal from the mosque at Ground Zero, and he said, and you should cover up. That was a great moment. You should be covering up, lady.
Well, what can I say, Laura? I know who the enemy is because they've defined themselves as such. We may not know who the enemy is, but they certainly knew who their enemy is, and it's us. And if the enemy has defined us as their enemy, how in the world can we sit here like idiots and say we don't know who the enemy is?
The book, Trickle Up Poverty, it is chock full of not only great commentary, but some great research on where this administration is taking us, what we can do now, what we can demand of our politicians today. If you want to be in the U.S. Senate, you got to look through, this pledge that Michael has offered, and it's an alternative in a way to what the Republicans have offered. Some other great juicy tidbits in there.